This video dives into the decisions we need to make when developing and designing our own musical controllers and musical control systems. All right, so there are 5 questions, and I pulled this straight from one of the leading books on digital music instrument design. This is by Marcelo Wanderley and Eduardo Miranda, 2 authors that get into all sorts of music technology awesomeness. All right, what do you want to do to control your musical instrument? Well, do you want to wave your hands? Do you want to control things discreetly? These are decisions you'll want to make, and you might find yourself informing yourself as you're developing the instrument. What controller sensor options do you have available? Right? We can fantasize about all the amazing things out there in the world, but let's think about what do we have at our fingertips, right? Do we have a launch pad or something like this? Do we have, some sort of grid-based controller? Do we have, a smartphone-based option? Like, what can we do? What do we have? Almost all of us have a camera available to us, so that's an option, and plus the mouse, trackpad, keyboard combination. What sounds do you want to make, right? You may find that as you're designing a controller that there are certain sounds that are like really exciting, but like you don't have a good way to perform them, and vice versa. You might find really boring sounds that you can perform really well, and that might not make sense to you. So we want to think about those sounds. Like, all right, what would be cool? What would it feel like to do this and have an amazing kind of sound happen versus like, little discrete kind of finger taps, like how huge of a sound do we want to make with a finger tap versus how huge of a sound does this kind of gesture imply, right? What is the technical approach of connecting these two things? You kind of have to define that in the process at some point, because otherwise we're just in kind of what we'd call fantasy land. It's like, oh man, I just want to wave my hands and have this explosive wonderful sound happen. Well, okay, what is it that, how do you get the information, the message of I'm waving my hands into the computer so that it can cause that cool sound to happen? How do you connect these 2 dots, right? We'll get into that technically in a future talk. What feedback do you need to perform well? Like when you are performing a regular instrument, you can feel things about the instrument. You know that you're, fingering a G on a saxophone when you press certain buttons. You know how hard you're kind of supporting your voice or supporting your breath with a woodwind or brass instrument. You know how much energy you're putting into your keys when you play a keyboard. That's all kind of like physical stuff. But with instruments that might not have a strong tactile feedback, you might need something like visual feedback to know, like for example, I need to kind of see where the edge of my frame is so that I stay, in frame. Otherwise I'm like wandering off asking, questions over here and you're like, oh, I'm behind the microphone, you can't see me. I need some visual feedback to know that I'm in frame. I try not to look at myself all the time because then you don't see me. I'm looking down on the ground here. So another one, the one that, so this is right from their book. This other one I have to answer is, what's your venue? Because that is going to inform a lot of things about how your performance makes sense. If your venue is here, it is the video frame, that's very different than if you're up on stage, 100 feet from your audience, doing things with your fingertips. You really got to think about, okay, I'm designing for this type of venue. What makes sense visually for me to do to relate to the sound that I want to make or trigger? So I've made this little plot of mapping precision versus abstraction and visibility versus obscurity. Like you can see what the performer is doing relative to not being able to see the performer. So I get that this is kind of abstract, so I'm going to fill in instruments in this map so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So drummer, maximum precision, right? Like they have got to hit perfectly on time, because like every strike of a drum where you're out of time, you're a bad drummer for however long people can remember that you played that sound out of time. It's also highly visible. Like there's no hiding the fact that you're winding up to hit a couple of cymbals, right? You know, the kick drum, yeah, that's not super visible, but the rest of the trap kit and the metal attached, highly visible when you're interacting with it. Guitar is also relatively much more visible than other instruments. Slightly abstracted because you could be doing palm muting, where you're resting the edge of your palm just a little bit on the strings to mute them a little bit, versus full strums. That's kind of subtle stuff that you might not be able to see super well. But the rest of it, you know, people can see what chords and notes you're playing. It's right there. The instrument faces the audience. Keyboards, on the other hand, tend to be harder for the audience to see. You know, you can see people when they kind of pull their hands up after hitting a strong chord or something like this, but if the keyboard is facing towards the audience, it's really hard to see what they're doing because the instrument itself kind of obscures your hands. You can turn yourself sideways like Tori Amos and a lot of the piano E competition folks that Yamaha put on. They turn the whole piano sideways so that you're seeing the hands as clear as day. Vocalists are kind of interesting because they're both very visible and then also not visible. Like what's happening in the instrument is a lot of it is down here in the vocal cords and in the diaphragm, which you can't see. I mean, like maybe Steven Tyler, you can see his diaphragm action because he's running around shirtless and you can see his muscles tense up as he's hitting a high note. But other stuff, like, you know, there's a certain amount of visibility in the articulation. You can see the mouth movement and these sorts of things. But if you're holding an SM58 right in front of your face, it's, you know, you're kind of blocking some of that visibility. But the rest of the performance, you know, the emotive moving, getting into the note, like really kind of rocking the thing, that is visible. And there is a certain amount of precision with vocals, right? You know, articulation of words, these sorts of things. But then there's a certain amount of abstraction of like, you're not necessarily just hitting notes, you're hitting notes with vowel sounds shaped to kind of move over time. And that can be obscured and kind of made kind of ephemeral in a way. And then on another extreme, we have a dancer, right? So what they're doing is highly visible. You can see what they're doing, but if they're controlling music through dance, the relationship between their movement and their action and the resulting sound is pretty disconnected, right? Like that's your artistic input. The last one, which is going to be covered up until I move my video over, is the DJ, right? Because you press play on a track, and what sound comes out, right? It's abstracted to a certain extent. You press play on one track, and it's in this banger. You press play on another track, and it's you know, like a chill step kind of a thing. So the same action, while there's a certain amount of precision to it, it is different every time, right? And a lot of times DJs, at least on stage, are somewhat obscured visibly from the audience. So I'm thinking of the elevated DJ who's working with a control surface, you know, whether it's turntables or whatever it might be. The audience doesn't see their hands super well unless there's some sort of video reinforcement that actually amplifies visually what they're doing, or it's a documentary on DJ culture and you're seeing them actually do things. But from the audience perspective, you know, down there on the dance floor, they're not seeing this stuff as clearly as they're seeing some of these other instruments and performers. So let's dig into things that we have and see how they connect to this plot. So let's see, what kind of controllers do we have available to us? The ASCII keyboard. So if we're using the laptop keyboard, where it's kind of like using a piano keyboard, you're obscured by the monitor unless you turn sideways. There was a electronic music producer, live electronic music performer, Warren Burt, who would always perform sideways so you could see when he was mousing and keyboarding. That said, like wireless keyboards are cheap. You could actually pick up the wireless keyboard and play it, like, you know, strap it to a piece of wood or something like this and play it visibly. Mouse and trackpad, same idea. If it is fixed to your table, it's going to be somewhat obscured from a stage perspective unless you shine a video camera down onto it. It's not going to be easy to see. But again, wireless mouse and keyboard, you could have, your mouse up here so that you're triggering things with your mouse while articulating things with a keyboard, for example. I don't know, that kind of sounds dorky at the moment, but it could be exciting for folks to be able to relate to what you're doing and see this awesome kind of stuff happening. The microphone as a controller. This one's kind of a trip because if you use a microphone that is not tied into the PA, you could use the sound of your voice to trigger sounds. You could use like the kind of beatboxing noises to trigger sounds. We can show you in Max how you can create little pops and clicks and snaps to, again, trigger things. You can do pitch tracking such that you're performing melodically, and instead of your voice being heard on the other end, you're causing a synthesizer to play. All right, other than microphone, camera. So we can do a rather visible and relatively abstract, like the dancer metaphor, using our camera as the control input. Mobile phone, we have a lot of options with the mobile phone because we can have very discrete controls. We can have very precise timing, like a drummer or a guitarist. It's very visible because you can get it out in front of people and rock it that way. And it has the ability to be quite abstract because you could make this gesture, a tilt and roll simultaneously gesture, mean one thing in one part of the song, and then in another, like in a build up, you could have it like opening a filter, right? And then when you change the drop or something like that, you can make a kind of more wobble based sound using the phone as your source of wobble. Others, like what other devices might you have? Like, I've been playing with the Novation, what is this? This is the Launchpad X, I believe. Kind of very satisfying in terms of like size to, what do you call it? Size to capability ratio. In the past, I've done things like put this on my chest so that I could trigger something in a highly visible way so that people could be like, oh, what's going on? Bam! Like, especially if you have it plugged in and lit up so that people can understand it. I've also seen Riot Music perform this where he just has the camera pointing at it usually he's wearing a GoPro on his head, and then he's performing it live so that this takes up most of the screen. Right, and then that becomes the performative element that becomes super visible and super precise. All right, what sounds do you want to make? Right, you want to do hits, something that's got a impact, like an immediate kind of sound. Okay, now you're thinking precision. Loops, like there's a certain amount of precision when the loop starts, but now it's kind of abstract because it's going on its own and your gestures don't really have much to do with it. Textures and paths, these are great when you want to have like really constant control in some way where your like movement is related to the sound continuously. Audio effects are a great way to have your sounds that are kind of within your genre space, like you have a drum loop going or something like that, and now you're tweaking like the reverb through your gestures. So like snares coming up, you have a huge reverb burst, like right on that beat or something like this. Or you like, my favorite thing is to do some sort of roll-like gesture like this to control a cutoff of a filter. So that's really fun when you have like an acid bass line and you're kind of filtering it as you roll your hand. So our mapping strategies, we have a bunch of kind of mapping strategies to think about, but the two that I think are the most useful conceptually are the one-to-many concept and the many-to-one concept. So one-to-many is, think about some of, if you use Ableton, there's something called an effects rack where you might have one knob, but that one knob is affecting several parameters in multiple different effects so that you have what I like, my favorite kind of concept is the more knob. So you might have a more knob if you're using a compressor where you are both lowering the threshold of when the compressor engages and increasing the makeup gain in one knob turn, so they're inversely related to each other. And like the more you turn the knob, the more insane the amount of compression artifacts start to become. And you get breathing and all sorts of other weird noises in your compression artifacts. But it's, again, one knob, you turn one knob and it controls multiple parameters. The opposite of that is many to one, where you might have to interact with multiple parameters to get one result. And I'm thinking in traditional instruments, that is precisely the keying of a woodwind, right? You have to do several key combinations with your fingers to get a single pitch to happen. And this might make a lot of sense, especially if you're doing like abstract gestures where you want to have one thing happen, and it requires tracking vertically, tracking size, these sorts of things. And of course, something that a lot of us do in this performance space is do many to one, and then one back to many, right? Where we have a lot of inputs going into the system that come down to one parameter, and then that one parameter goes and is mapped out to dozens of parameters, for example. All right, what's your mapping approach tech? Are you thinking about linear mapping? And that's where I do this action, and this action does the same thing with the sound every time. It's very consistent. You might think of it as a one-to-one, not in the sense of parameters, like one knob turn to one effects parameter, but that same knob turn only controls those effects the same way every time, right? Do we want to do score dependent? So that would be like, just like when I'm pressing next on the keyboard here to go to the next slide, it's the same next button, but what you see on screen is different every time I hit that next button. And that's relative to the development of this slide deck. And it could be the same with their score. You could be doing this gesture or snapping your fingers or whatever it might be to trigger like the start of a loop, and then you could snap your fingers and trigger the end of the loop. And this would all be dependent on the context of where you are in the score or where you are in the musical development of the piece. Chaos and complexity. This one's sort of a fun space for me because sometimes you can get obsessed with the precision of control where the precision doesn't actually help you musically. I found this happening a lot when I would do things like I would use like a tilt or roll parameter for volume, which meant that I would put my hand out. There might be something in my hand or something like this, but I'm holding my hand relatively still while doing all this other business just to keep the volume right. And that was silly. Like I was spending a lot of effort trying to keep my hand just right so that the mix would sit properly. And I wouldn't recommend doing that. Sometimes you just got to give up a little bit of control to get something musically interesting to happen. And so interacting with chaos is one way to do that. And a really compelling illustration for interacting with chaos is if you're using live feedback and a microphone or a guitar up against a guitar amp, you get a little bit of effects, a little bit of an echo, a little bit of a reverberation as you hold that microphone closer to the speaker and closer to the speaker. But at some point, it just goes sideways and kind of explodes into this terrible howl. And that's kind of a fun place to be, because if you can get to the edge of chaos and then come back, now you have a fun kind of tension release game to play in your performance, because you're like, if I go here, it almost explodes, and the audience could feel that you're fighting the tension. You're just getting right in there surgically, and it's about to explode. But no, that's not the right part of the song for an explosion to happen. And then you can build that tension, and then release it. Just like in the build-drop paradigm of EDM, like you build the energy, and when you release that drop, bam, there's a visceral response where we're like, yes. So, playing with chaos, playing with complexity gives you a place of danger to go to that can really play with tension and make an experience like really, really hit hard. So your feedback. What do you need to see? What do you need to hear? What do you need to know in order to perform? Like sometimes you need to know where the sensors are. Like, is everything working? Like maybe you need to do that at least during sound check, but you need to know that everything's functional. Sometimes you might need to know that, okay, I'm in this position, I'm in at position 9, and for the drop I want to be in position 10 or 11 in this case. You don't want to accidentally go all the way to 11 prematurely, so sometimes it's helpful to know where you are in your knob turn. And if you don't have a tactile or kinetic way to feel that in terms of your position, sometimes you need a visual feedback in order to see it on screen or something like this. On the current state of effects and things, you might want to know where things are if you're at the beginning of a loop or the end of a loop or something like this. Also, what's coming up in time, if, for example, when I'm pressing the key to go to the next slide, usually if I wasn't doing a video recording where I could like edit out a goof up, when I'm live, I like to see the next slide so that I know what's coming next. When I hit that button, I'm not like, oh, I forgot that I edited the slide deck last week and removed like a bunch of stuff that was transitioning into this new concept. You know, it's nice to know what's coming up next, so that if you are committing to a gesture, like a really big bravado gesture, that the big bravado sound actually happens. You know, if you have this big riser kind of getting up to a build and you like do something huge to show that the drop is been triggered, and then like it just repeats the start of the riser again, and you're like, ugh. Like that can be a bummer. So again, context. What happens with the next? What's coming up in time? What's coming up if I do this gesture? Does it happen, or is it happening on the next cue? We want to know that. So I mentioned a few times, what's your ideal venue, right? Do you want to perform on that elevated stage where people are looking up to you, or do you want to be on the in a theatrical context where there's a rake and people are looking down to you? Do you want to perform out in the open, like Onyx Ashanti here is performing? I believe this is in Berlin, but don't quote me on that. He does a lot of street performance where he's got some batteries and he's performing with his controllers live, making music in real time, improvising and looping and these sorts of things. And it's kind of cool because people can come up and really see what's going on. He's not like separated out. There isn't like that barrier of fences and bouncers and things like that between him and the audience. They can just come up and see what he's doing. Do you want to perform online? Again, like Riot Music, where you're performing with videos and people are experiencing that way, you know, because that really might inform things. They're like big, you know, theatrical gestures that may not make sense over video. They may seem like dorky or there might just be something that just doesn't make sense. I was actually thinking about some documentary videos on rock music that I saw a few years ago, where like live, like there's certain gestures that make sense live, you know, like big kind of arm gestures that on video just seem like, what you doing? What? I don't get it. Why is that gesture? Why is that happening? It doesn't make sense. So, you know, as you're thinking about your ideal venue, you might think about what are the gesture languages, what are the things that make sense in that venue. So let's think about capturing our initial design. So what are our aspirations and inspirations? You know, what artists out there are we thinking about? What fantasies do we have about performing? What sounds would we love to play with, right? So let's make a sketch of that. Let's list all of those things that we want to put together and turn that into an action item list. So, okay, I need to go get my camera plugged in. I need to get some software that allows me to get data from the camera, or I need to go get the app for the iPhone and get that all set up. You know, maybe I need to learn a couple of things in order to make this happen. All of that kind of stuff. Of course, once you get into building things, you're going to find yourself encountering some conflicts. So your imagination is in one space. It's like, oh, I have fantasies, awesome. And then reality sometimes gets in the way, and it's like, you know, like this doesn't work, or this is too expensive. And when I say expensive, I mean in terms of financial expense, or probably more importantly, time expense. Like if you have to learn a brand new set of skills in order to execute this, and that's going to take you 6 months. Okay, do you have a plan for a 6-month development, or do you want to get your ideas going, you know, in the next week? So you have to do some reality sifting. What we really want to do, though, is get the Venn diagram where these two things come together, because where they overlap is the place of awesomeness. Because when our imagination can push the envelope of reality beyond where it was yesterday, that's when we get exciting things. That's where our audience gets excited. That's where we as artists get excited. So let's look for the overlap of awesomeness whenever we can. And if that doesn't work, there's always the option of smoke, mirrors, and magic. So where this might have some artistic conflict is the idea of live versus lip synced. I've seen several DJs who are doing cool things, maybe even just dancing, but you know, also kind of reaching for like a knob every once in a while, that may or may not be actually doing anything musically relevant with those knobs, especially if you're just kind of tweaking like a filter a little bit while like an entire finished track is playing. That might not be a significant musical control, but in some ways that doesn't make it invalid, right? There's still a performance happening there, and there's still some magic that we feel as an audience member watching that person get into their groove, get excited about the build, react visually when the drop arrives. So that that's going to be an artistic decision. It's really kind of up to you, and whether you want to have a backup plan of a lip synced version, it's really up to you artistically. There is a certain amount of risk and reward with doing things live, right? Because things could go wrong. I'm pretty sure Deadmau5 was quoted with saying something along the lines of like, we all press play, and that's largely because there's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars on the line. So for big shows, with synchronized video and lights and smoke and all of this stuff, these things are all locked into what they call SMPTE time code, and they can't really improvise in the same context that we might be thinking of in our context, because in that context, if something went bad, that entire stadium full of people would get a less good show. On the other hand, that's precisely what a rock show is when in traditional instrument land. They are playing live. They've got good at playing their instruments. They are excellent at playing together, and the show happens right in front of you. Like, if those people didn't pick up their instruments and make sound, the show wouldn't happen. You could play back a tape and it'd be like, okay, empty stage and a playback. There's concerts where that works, but in the case of rock music, I don't think it does. Dance music, I think they can get away with that because the show might not necessarily be up there on the stage. The show might be down on the dance floor. But the risk-reward ratio can be kind of awesome, because if you take a risk and the audience understands you're taking a risk, and then it succeeds, like it could fail, but it doesn't, it succeeds, there's something that you've now created a little extra bond with that audience. Like, they're committed to you succeeding. They know you could fail. It's scary. They get that you're on that razor's edge, and when you win, it's like, you up there on stage are the hero, and we come along in that journey and are grateful for it. Robustness has a huge input on the previous two, because if your system is not very robust, you might be putting more risk than potential reward is available. You get up on stage and the thing is probably going to crash or fail in some way. That kind of means that you need to perform in front of an audience that is just as happy with your taking a high risk and failing as they would be if you were working with something that was definitely going to succeed. But keep in mind, there are audiences who really love people putting the cutting edge right on things and being on that razor's edge and knowing that more likely they will fail. I'm thinking of academic concerts in particular, because part of their job as researchers is to push that edge so far that you almost can't succeed. And if you do, oh my God, it's glorious. And if you don't, that's good in a way, because they've pushed the envelope so far that they crash and burn. And sometimes that's worth it. Sometimes that makes the success more valuable, because if their system is so robust, they never ever fail, and there's no risk of failure, then what is success if there's no risk of failure? It's just like, well, they did their thing that they always do and could do without effort. If there's effort, there's investment, and if there's investment by the artist, there's probably investment by the audience, and when that investment pays off, it's so rich. So we're thinking about what are our options. We maybe have made a couple changes in order to make reality and our imagination come together. We've thought about our backup options of, like, we could lip sync a little bit of some things if we were performing live, and one thing didn't work, we have a backup plan of, like, maybe the tape will take over and we can dance with the tape, even though, like, we should have been triggering something on the next cue. Let's take those new ideas and revisit our design. Let's update that sketch. Let's get those action items dialed in. Let's go make something, man. Let's capture that lightning and make something awesome. All right, let's go.